Welcome to We Need to Talk, where we try to figure out the meaning of life and how to reduce dissatisfaction. If you'd like to figure out what the shadow archetype is, how it can make you more psychologically whole and also make you more attractive, then listen to the end of this video where we explain how the shadow is a part of your unconscious mind that contains all the repressed traits that you do not want to associate your identity with. We'll talk about shadow projections where you're basically judging other people for specifically those traits that you dislike about yourself and the traits that lie in your shadow. And finally, how integrating the shadow makes you psychologically a stronger, more wise individual and actually more attractive also. So if you want to learn about that, listen to the entire episode, enjoy it, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's go.
Let's move on to the shadow archetype. So I'll quickly just do like a rough run through, and then you can like say like whatever you think like should be added.
Yes.
So the shadow is part of your unconscious mind that encompasses all the traits, experiences. No, it's more the traits, like personality traits that you do not want to associate with your identity, with your ego. Yep. And it grows, the shadow grows like this. When you're very young and you don't really have like a strict conscious identity, the shadow doesn't exist yet. But it begins to exist when you start to conform to some kind of a demand from your parents or society. Your parents want you to act out a certain way and they reward you then. So you start to learn, okay, if I'm helpful at home, I help with the cleaning up, whatever, the parents like it and they get rewarded. Then you start to build this identity that will increase the likelihood of you being included in social groups. And now you need to understand that this is a very fundamental drive to create this identity or be included in a group because your survival depends on it. Like it's a really primordial urge to create this or just to find a way to be included in it. Usually entails building an identity that will resonate and people will like and your parents will like, and especially your parents, because when you're a kid you are entirely dependent on your parents, so you better make them happy, because if you piss them off and they kick you out, you're essentially cream crackers, you're dead. So anyway, you start to build this identity. So for example, you think you're a helpful person and you throw your potential for being lazy and being unhelpful and being selfish into your shadow. You don't want to associate yourself with it. And also in regards to social groups or society, the typical traits that you'll find in the shadow would be something like violence, sexual like urges, greed, anything that the group will dislike. Basically, that's what you throw into your shadow then, and is part of your unconscious mind, which you don't want to associate with yourself. Yep.
And very good to make the distinction. We're not talking here about archetype. This is way more where you have like your Jungian ego, then you have the shadow, and then those combined form the self with a capital S. And the thing is, because you create something, you inherently destruct and destroy something, and that what is destroyed goes into the shadow, and they are always in balance. Or, I mean, they're supposed to be in balance, unless the shadow's so much in the unconscious, and there might be a situation where it flips and the shadow just takes over. But over a longer time, there will be like the term of homeostasis, where things just tend to go back to balance like a normal state. So it's good to know that you simply cannot ignore it. Like it will be there anyways. And the idea of this half of the podcast is also making sure that there is value in it and how to retract.
Well, you can ignore the shadow, but you mean it'll always be there though?
Yeah. And it won't go away. Like, I mean, you can ignore it, but it will still pop up eventually.
Yep. It's just a matter of when, not if.
Yeah.
So the shadow always sits behind the the identity basically of who you want to identify with. It sits behind that. Now, the stronger your identity, the more rigid your identity, the denser and the darker the shadow, and the greater the likelihood of it when it manifests itself, that you won't be able to control yourself. So if you suddenly have this urge for violence, you won't be able to control it and sort of mitigate it, because you don't see it coming, and also you don't know how to work with it, because you never thought you could act it out. You thought it wasn't part of you, and you're suddenly basically you become this other person. And one thing to tie into this, what I wanted to say in the beginning, is the concept of the deity in Greek and Roman culture. So the Greek gods and the Roman gods, that was a nice example of how humans created a concept of the unconscious mind. They thought that the Romans were, sorry, the gods were these forces that would play with the humans, and the humans, were sort of lay at the mercy of the gods. And what that was is the humans, the Romans and the Greeks, observed that sometimes they act in ways, or their fate changes randomly, like as if out of nowhere something's controlling them. There's a part, and they basically projected that observation onto this concept of, okay, there are gods that are playing with us. So if, for example, if you'd have a sudden urge for violence, you would have say like Mars, in the Roman god Mars, the god of war, took hold of you and was playing, was sort of directing you because you tried to act out this violence. But so just to go through, so it's all about choosing an identity that is acceptable, and all the unacceptable traits go into the shadow.
But then the question is, like, what makes us have to choose this identity? And that is, I think the answer to that is culture. And this is also like I've read a bit of the book, like Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson, and it's an excellent book. We're not sponsored, but he states that culture creates a shadow because you have to integrate into certain norms and values, and you simply can't be a weirdo in culture, and therefore you have to leave aside certain traits you have, and you have to abide by certain rules. But those parts you inherently had, they're not going to be gone. Like, they're just in a different place in your psyche, but they'll be there. So in that sense, more like highly cultured countries and nations also will have a stronger side. And this might be very far-fetched, but he in the book also makes the argument that the wars we have had are due to the highly civilized cultured world in the western part, without good solid containment of the shadow, and that has bursted out into people raging. And essentially what you also do, this is a combination of shadow and projection, which is where you unconsciously, so it means you don't know you have these traits, but if you see them in someone else, your unconscious will recognize, and they will become very mad at this person, even though it is actually telling you like, I have that too, and I'm mad at myself for being able to act out such behavior. So you define a scapegoat. And I know, well, we all know when that term was mostly used wasn't in the brightest time of history. So.
Dude, you just you just touched upon a lot. So like I said, the reason the shadow is created is in order to be included into to the society and fit to the norms, to be,
Yes.
or else you get ostracized and you become lonely and die, sort of. And that's cool. Like, the societies that have really strict norms probably have a dense shadow. So, and like you said, in Nazi Germany, very rigid, sort of, what would they call it? Eugenics. Like, they were all about eugenics, trying to find a way to propagate the superior race. And they were all about, this is the right way. This is, the Aryan race is superior.
Yeah.
And, all these absurd sort of ideological claims on how to live life. And because they're so rigid, but the human is far more complex and there's so many attributes, only a small part of the attributes fit into that norm, and all the rest thrown into the shadow, and it becomes really big and really dense, and then eventually it explodes and is unloaded on whatever's around.
Yeah, and I'm gonna give like 3 other tangible examples. And this is in cities like Amsterdam, here in Zurich, like any city where banking life is big, you have to put on like quite a persona in banking life. You'll probably know a bit about that. And at the same time, there's a very dark side with cocaine and lots of like weird parties with extravagant activities going on. That's like definitely one way people act out their shadow. Another one is the Catholic Church. They had pretty strict values and celibacy for the pastors and priests. Well, that didn't turn out to be celibacy either. They definitely indulged in like fucking weird things, like the mass ceremonies back in the 16th century and Middle Ages. Really disgusting stuff.
What's that?
Yeah, I'm not gonna go into that. It's like human sacrifices and really awful things. And he
Really?
describes it in this book as well. Yeah, it's very weird.
Well,
And
dude, you need to
then
go into that a little bit. I want to write it. Mass ceremonies.
I think that's what they call them. Yeah.
In what country was this?
Well, this is like Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, so that's like Western Europe. And the other example is like very rigid and strict families, where the parents are like so strict that the kids will just find ways to really mess themselves up in self-destructive behavior. I've seen that a bit with my sister, where she really derailed for like 1 or 2 years, and it's because there's such a rigid norms like laid towards the kids. So there are like 3 more practical examples where the more disciplined someone needs to be, the bigger the shadow will eventually follow.
Dude, yeah, I mean, let's go into that family example. It's really, I mean, what it boils down to is the amount of tolerance that the norm allows. Because if there's no tolerance, then the pressure to suppress the negative traits is super high, and then it becomes like super unconscious. But it's also one thing we need to point out is it's not necessarily all negative traits. It's just whatever trait does not fit to the norm. So for example, if you had a really sort of overtly, rigidly masculine father who would leave no space for showing empathy or emotions, then as a man, you might grow up and, have not really identify with emotions and feelings, and you wouldn't be able to listen to them, and they would all be in your shadow. So
Yeah, and to add to that, it's really cool because it's highly cultural, which means shadow parts in European culture can be culture like positive culture part in Japan, for example. So it's also it's very different per culture. And to quickly elaborate on the Catholic Mass to get it right, I read from page 23 onwards of the book. The Catholic Mass is a masterpiece of balancing our cultural life. If one has the courage to see, the Mass is full of the darkest things. There is incest, betrayal, rejection, torture, death, and worse.
so that's what was going on in these ceremonies.
Yeah.
Damn.
But it was to balance the
Oh,
so this is like ceremonies they did as to act out their shadow part in order to balance it, but that is like pretty horrific.
yeah, that's not like the way to do it. Like, yeah, people might think now, well, if we have these urges for violence or something, do we have to act it out? No, that's not the takeaway. The takeaway is you should integrate it into your personality so you have the potential to be violent, and punch someone when no one's looking. No, it's about it's about finding a channel to release that energy, or really not even no like yeah, like punch a boxing bag or something like that. It's but that's not even it. You say like,
But
hey, what if I have what?
there's symbolic ways to go about it. He mentions like a couple examples because inherently it could be a creative process too, where people would just write like awful stories, or they would just imagine things, or some people would make music, others would create like a bonfire and just like perform certain like non-violent rituals. Like there's different ways to indeed integrate it, but we'll discuss that later on, I think.
Mm. I think one way of actually the thing is it's you don't actually have the urge to be violent, but you have the urge to for it to be given energy and for it to be accepted. Like it's like a little child that wants attention. And if you don't give it attention, it'll get upset and it'll, run rampage. So it's about the you don't actually have the urge necessarily for violence, but the violent trait, the trait of violence wants to be consciously integrated into your awareness. It wants to be given awareness and be processed and dealt with. That's what it is, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool.
Amen. And I think other reasons besides this highly disciplined part of culture that can create the shadow, there's three more reasons I kind of figured out. Well, one of them, which has to do with culture, is a very high level of technology, because due to technology, we are very, very little connected to nature, and nature can in itself be very destructive, and we are simply not aware of how harsh nature can be, and we don't face the brutal consequences of that anymore. But moreover, other things like technology, like phones, social media, video games, those kind of things, they create, they're made to create a lot of efficiency and to ease in our lives. But with that comes the boredom we have, because we can do anything all day. We don't have to, I don't have to like chase a cow and like kill it and like whatever and like build a hut every night. Like I don't have to do those things. So the technology part has also allowed us, outside of this creativeness, create a lot of boredom and loneliness and suffering. So that is one aspect one has to be very careful of, that there is a downside to this creative part. Another reason I found is simple like ignorance, where someone doesn't self-monitor and just really, the shadow will just grow unknowingly, and it will just keep on popping up and someone just doesn't know. And then the last one, which can be seen as a good trait, like self-discipline and self-censoring, that also increases your shadow if you won't be aware of it. So someone who's highly, highly disciplined will therefore self-censor and will eventually create the shadow part if you want it or not.
Mhm. So the technology thing is, or with social media, the let's say the need to fit in has been amplified. So
Mm,
the ego or the identity has become even more rigid or even more concise, let's say, and is under examination all the time. So it's you need to make sure the negative traits are even further away from your identity, because like the risk of it being attributed to you is even higher now because the whole world is watching you, kind of.
yeah.
um
I think I then didn't explain properly. Let me rephrase technology. I think it might more be like technological devices that just help our daily life, like central heating, washing machine, a dryer, the dishwasher, all those things that make our life so much more efficient and easy, which then creates a whole lot of time which we don't spend out in nature, which is a perfect way to balance kind of your shadow side. So you will then find shadow things or negative sides to let it out, because you're inherently not in contact with the nature of nature.
Yeah. So it's kind of like when you're in nature, you're immersed in the diversity and the complexity and
And the
the ugliness.
struggle, yeah.
Yeah, the struggle and the harshness, the judgment of nature. But whereas when you detach from it, you start to build this conception that life is very clean, and you also
Yeah.
need to be clean then. And yeah, I mean, yeah, like nature is very politically incorrect and brutal.
Yeah.
And human isn't like, it's a reflection of nature. Human is nature, and hence human has the potential to be harsh, ugly, and politically incorrect,
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's like 4 ways you develop your own shadow.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just seeing what other things to talk about here. So the consequences of a bigger of a greater shadow is, yeah, you have pressure to validate that shadow, or to prove or to continue the consistency of your identity, because the greater the shadow, the more you're afraid of the repressed traits, so you're like even under greater pressure. But also, the greater your shadow, the greater your identity, or the let's say the more rigid your identity, the less you experience life, because you only listen to parts of your feelings, and you don't really experience the full bandwidth or the intensity or the diversity of the flavors of life, I would say, also. But that's a bit more abstract. Okay, I think it'd be cool to dive into the projection thing, and then also I have some examples of personal shadow integrations. So
Yes.
the projection, like you said before, is really cool. It's a super easy way to know what's in your shadow. Observe who you judge badly, and for what traits, or based on what traits you're judging them badly. Because it's kind of funny, humans are really diverse and complex, and they have so many characteristics, but somehow your mind is choosing to judge one specific trait. So it's not a coincidence what trait it's judging. It has a meaning. There's a reason why you're honing on this specific trait. And it is, like you said, because you dislike that characteristic and you've repressed it, so you have a negative relationship with it. So when you see it in someone else, you hate it, you despise it. And that's because, on the one hand, you've learned to really dislike and repress that trait, but also it's a mechanism for your shadow to try and enter into your consciousness by it projects itself onto someone else, which then you observe and you are aware of and you're conscious of, which is supposed to help you then integrate it and notice, like, why am I judging this person? Oh, I'm actually judging them for the precise reason, for the precise trait that I have myself.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Amazing.
That's projection.
Yeah, really like realizing that just helps you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, because
And
it's such a basic method to understand what's in your shadow.
yeah, yeah. I mean, more judging people, so more, yeah.
Because basically what's happening is you've been judged by the norm, and you've grown to be accepted by the norm, but then you are part of the norm. You're like an extension of the norm, and you are the norm then judging somebody else. It's like that. The process continues, or it's a chain reaction.
Mm.
So I think, together with NoFap, shadow integration, I think, has been the strongest personality development process, I think, in my life. And the reason why is because it makes you psychologically more whole, more wise, more grounded, but also really it makes you heavy. And this is a bit abstract, but life is really complex. And if you could span life out between two poles, in order to grasp as much of it as possible, you would need to sort of like open your eyes to as much of it as possible. And it's the same with the psychology. The more you want, the greater your the more wise you are, or the more, if you want to have more access to your being, you need to observe and understand a greater bandwidth. And that entails going from one extreme to the other extreme. It's from the light to the dark, from the ego to the shadow. It's the full bandwidth. Yeah. And when you do that, you become more relaxed, I think, more whole. You become more confident, more, you have this equanimity, this calmness, and this wisdom to you, because you're less insecure. You understand yourself, and you have this power, this strength, because you understand your potential also, and you can direct that potential, because you finally, your consciousness has access to the more of the unconscious storage that's within you. Whereas for a lot of people, the unconscious is still the thing in power, and it's just dominating your consciousness. You're like a slave to it. That was a bit of a ramble.
Damn, that's good. It's
Cool.
really good.
Awesome.
Mm.
So let's just do like examples of shadow integration. I think one thing is just like my relationship with music, with hip hop and rap versus mainstream or even like punk rock. So from the age of 12 to now, I would say 95% of the music I've heard was just pure hip hop and rap. That's quite peculiar, because I'm from like, I mean, like from a, I don't come from a community that listens to a lot of rap. But the reason why I gravitated to it, first of all, because my sister introduced it to me. I listened to Get Rich or Die Trying by 50 Cent at the age of like 12, which in hindsight, I don't know if that was a good idea, dude. But awesome album, absolutely dope. But I liked it so much because it gave me superiority, because it was gangster, it was hard, it was like assertive, it was masculine, it was strong, it was powerful, whilst all the mainstream like sort of pop rock, or not, like punk rock kind of emo, that vibe was sort of, everybody else listened to it, and it was kind of like emotional, it was weak. I didn't want to listen to it because I didn't want to be like the others. I wanted to step out, I wanted to be authentic, and that's why I loved hip hop so much. And I do still like it a lot, but now I'm like catching up with the punk rock emo phase, dude. I'm listening to what's it called? Let me just pull up my Spotify too. Like, I'm listening to where are they? I mean, Machine Gun Kelly released like a punk rock album. Added essentially almost all the songs. Like My Chemical Romance, 30 Seconds to, I don't even know. 30 Seconds to Mars. I found them yesterday. 30 Seconds to Mars and stuff like Panic at the Disco, Green Day. What else? Just a lot of that. Like American Rejects. Just all of that vibe. Like that sort of like emotional, kind of pessimistic, I hate my life. That kind of like, I'm just like have to catch that up now, and I'm really enjoying it. But yeah, that's, for example, how I wanted my identity was trying to be strong and masculine and like hard and aggressive, and all the weak like emotional music was not cool. I didn't want to be like that, so I pushed it out of my identity into my shadow.
Okay.
Do you have an example of a
Yeah,
shadow?
it's way different.
Go for it.
It's like I've told you before, but it's pretty vulnerable in a sense and very open.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really cool. Like we did the shadow workshop back in February
March.
somewhere, January,
Yeah.
March, whatever. I don't know exactly. And I think we had both had like a misconception. We just didn't research the topic good enough. So I was like finding YouTube videos on it, and I found this video which is about like shadow side and sexual repression, and I just clicked on it because I was interested. Something might have guided me there. I don't know. And I realized throughout my youth, or yeah, I would say youth, I whenever someone would make a comment about homosexuality towards me, like not about someone else, but really oriented towards me, I would be able to like remember it for years. Like it would just stuck to me. Like I recall my mom like they just make innocent jokes like, "Oh, that's so gay." I'm like why? And my dad would always also make jokes about it. My friends and I would do the same. Like it would just be, I thought it was just casual fun, but I think this might be due to like messed up pornography too. I just had like I was just unknown what my sexual orientation was, and I've always like shied away from actually investigating the thought of like what if I'm not heterosexual. And before that workshop, I finally dared to just write out like what was going on in my mind, and I was just like trying to accept like what if like what's the worst that can happen? I was like, okay, your friends might look weird at you. Your parents will be like, what? And they'll still love you because they are. At least my parents unconditionally love me. And I was like, that's bad. And then the worst is like, well, you're probably not gonna have your own kids then. I was like, okay, that will definitely hurt. It's like the price of that would be to live an unfulfilled life for the rest of your life if you don't truly know who you are deep down in a sexuality way as well. Well, you'll be just simply not be yourself. And for me to accept the ability or yeah, the ability to perhaps be like bisexual or like had homosexual or whatever, like just accepting that it doesn't have to be that rigid was like just felt so good. I was like, oh my god, this feels just like very heartwarming, and I felt like my soul was like on fire in a good way. And I still feel this when I talk about it. If I am open to someone, I like still feel it. Like it feels really good. And for me, that was like a part of the shadow where I've always like I've just neglected the idea because I thought it was disgusting. And my dad always made comments about it. My friends would laugh about it. So I was like, well, if I would be that, I would be my whole life would be judged, like my entire being. And now I'm like, I still don't know. Like honestly, I still don't know, which I think is like for me, it gives me some sort of calmness that I'm at least able to honestly say this. Like it really feels good for me. This might be a very weird way of acting out the shadow, but that is how I integrated it. And as you said, that gives like equanimity to me. Yeah. So that was one hell of an experience.
Mm. But when you said earlier on, you have the potential to have like an unfulfilled life for the rest of your life. That is, if you didn't reflect on it, or
Yeah, like if I would essentially die and I would still be like, oh, but what if I'm actually not heterosexual? Like that would be the worst thing. That would be like,
because then you wouldn't have been yourself in hindsight.
no, you would have like just neglected this part. And it could also just be a very feminine part of me, which is another archetype. It could also be that. But I know I have a lot of feminine energy or femininity in me, and it could be that. But I just don't want to close my eyes anymore to my true sexual orientation, and that would just feels good to be able to, as a man, say that. I'm like, yes, it feels. Yeah.
Dude, thanks a lot for sharing that. That takes serious guts. Serious, absolute guts, man. I think once you accept or you integrate that shadow trait, it's the thing was at first the reason why these traits are in the shadows because we think they are bad in some way. But actually, despite it originally being thought to be bad, they're actually the source of so much creativity and potential, these traits. Like you can like transform if somebody's like, I don't know, or even let's say, if I'm not saying in your case, but if somebody were to be homosexual and they would reflect on it and realize it, then like the amount of like energy and inspiration and creativity from that authentic sexual orientation, that the type you just can't lie about, like it could change the world, man. It could, it's just, you're unlocking this source of power, just like sheer power, not in like dominating power, but just potential. And it's unbelievable when you also, when that feeling of be accepting yourself or integrating it into your personality is kind of like you leveled up. You're this new, like this new self. And I do think when you see somebody who's who's like a leader, a really strong leader, is somebody who is also as a man, like a male leader, is also feminine and understanding and empathetic and all these, but also has serious potential for violence and like sheer aggression also. But it's that like you choose to restrain it. That's the thing. You're a monster who chooses not to act out the monstrous traits, the monstrous behavior, let's say. But you have the ability to. It's just, and that's why I think it makes it also very attractive, is you have this, you're multifaceted then, and you have all these, you're just you manifest more of your potential. That's really it.
Well, and you're like speaking out the highest truth possible to yourself, and that, as you said, that makes you untouchable. Like no one can harm you. Then like there's no way, if you are so deeply grounded in, because that is, I mean, that is the essentially when you marry the shadow and the ego and you become the self. That is when you're like divine in a sense.
Well,
Yeah,
but like becoming the self, you'd also have to integrate the anima,
yeah. But I
and
mean, this
that's
is
a
a
tough
part of
one.
it. This is a part of it.
Yeah,
It's like a
that's
step.
it's the first step. It's a really key step. Yes.
And to my experience also, if you like, if you bottle up this shadow side of yourself long enough, it will seriously cause you like physical constraints somewhere in your gut. Like it's very weird, as if there's like a rope just tangled in there. And once you speak that truth to yourself, you investigate into the thoughts and the perhaps even actions within your shadow side, and you dig them up and you confront them. It's like it just really distangles, and it's like just unlocks like power, like
Yeah, it's like
it radiates.
your physiology reacts to it. And this, I once heard somebody say this. A hypothesis about why men tend to die earlier than women, or live to a younger age and die, is because they bottle up feelings, and then they have this tension within them which just drains them
Mhm.
uh, physically, and they just deteriorate faster because they have more stress within them that they don't process. And that, like you said, when you accept that shadow trait, your 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 body just kind of takes a deep breath, and it's really opening. Like you
Yes.
kind of like open up. It's like your body reacts to it.
Hmm.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I
Cool.
was about to mention one other shadow side, but that's more the anima. So we'll leave that to another podcast.
Yeah, exactly. We'll do another episode on the anima slash animus, which is
Hmm.
a whole new, another archetype. Basically, the anima is the, let's say, the female within the man, but it's a lot more than that. Like it's a lot more intense than that.